Hello, here's a presentation on detecting Hafnium with EventTracker. You have by no doubt by now heard about this attack. On March 2nd of this year, Microsoft provided some patches and said that this was a small targeted attack on premise Microsoft Exchange servers 13, 16, and 19. And in fact, later on, they even announced it as 10. In retrospect, it turns out to be anything but small and has affected tens of thousands of customers around the globe. In the release, Microsoft noted that the security alert was reported by Volexity earlier on Jan the 6th of this year. A day later, Microsoft and US CERT released indicators of compromise, which of course we updated our threat intelligence platform called Threat Center with and propagated it to all consoles late that evening. We also published a detailed advisory that's available to you on my.netsurian.com, and we've updated that. It's worth noting that the attacks were not prevented by any of the popular endpoint security solutions, which means that this fell once again to blue teams to detect and respond and identify the attack systems and prioritize defenses and patching. Here's a brief on the timeline of the attack. Volexity early in January detects these and then reports them to Microsoft, who then starts working on a fix. But before the fix can be deployed on the 2nd, it gets exploited by other groups, Stick, Lucky Mouse, Calypso, and WinNTI. Microsoft does release the out-of-band patch, but then by then the floodgates are open and everybody and his brother is interested, and lots of ransomware attackers are busy getting on this. So how does this attack actually happen? Well, it turns out that there are 4 zero-day vulnerabilities that were chained together. The first one of which allows you to get a server-side request forgery and takes arbitrary HTTP requests and allows it to authenticate as the Exchange server. After that, another insecure deserializational vulnerability allows the user to iterate mailboxes and exfiltrate emails. The original objective of the attacker was to grab emails from the compromised Exchange machine and run away with them. But it turned out that you could also run code as system on the Exchange server, which means that you could do web shells. Web shells are a particular source of evil and deploy them on the compromised server, which means that never mind just exfiltrating email, you could actually move laterally and do other kinds of evil. What's a web shell, you ask? Well, a web shell is a malicious program that allows you to control a web server and execute whatever you like and acts like a command line interface. If you are able to access the web server, why then the attacker can actually upload such a web shell and then start accessing the file system and whatnot. A famous one is called the China Chopper. You will hear that mentioned often in regards to Hafnium. It was first observed in 2012. It's small in size and it's quite difficult to detect. Notice that it's slipped by all the popular endpoint security programs. Microsoft confirmed with high confidence that the original attack was exploited by Chinese state actors. However, after the vulnerability was opened, it turns out that a lot of different crime groups have exploited that vulnerability. The state actors are noted for their stealth, and so they'd never really ever be noisy. The fact that you hear so much about this says that the vulnerability is being exploited by other folks. So what are the consequences? Well, first of all, on-premise Exchange servers are accessed in an attempt to get email accounts, but then additional malware like this web shell to facilitate long-term access to the victim environment. And they primarily attacked infectious disease researchers, think COVID, law firms, think IP, intellectual property, think educational institutions, defense contractors, that kind of thing. But since then, ESET, for example, has identified at least 10 different APT groups that are trying to use this vulnerability for things like ransomware and so on. It exploded. I mean, essentially, you can look here at this graph released by ESET, and you can see that on the 3rd, when Microsoft released the patch, subsequently thereafter, because defenders don't patch immediately, there was an explosion of attacks and on-premise servers were being attacked like crazy. So what specifically happens? Well, as I mentioned to you, they use the 4th vulnerability to deploy a web shell. And this is what a web shell could look like if it was in ASPX. And what Microsoft noted in their blog was there was a particular sequence of events for the particular attack that happened. Now, once you get a web shell, You can do pretty much anything you want, but this is what that particular web shell was doing at the time. They were dumping LSAS process memory in order to be able to get access to the PST files. PST is, of course, where Microsoft stores, all of your email, and they were compressing that with 7-zip using an Exchange snap-in in order to export the mailbox data. This is done using PowerShell, right? Subsequently, they were doing a one-line reverse shell that allows them, directly via PowerShell to have a TCP listener and then connect out to GitHub, grab a hold of PowerCat, and be able to take the data out from the compromised server over to the IP address of their choice. So if you couldn't detect the web shell, maybe you could detect all of this post-compromise activity, which is exactly how the original Defender, Volexity, and before them DevCore were able to identify this. Because web shells are very difficult to detect, they actually saw it occurring on a Exchange server, and they speculated that this was a web shell, and they tried to investigate what is it that it was doing. So in summary, stealthy attacks from advanced groups continue, and the traditional defenses that you have are unable to really detect them. It was only December that we saw the example of SolarWinds, where a supply chain was compromised, and all of the endpoint protection was really unequal to the task. It was eventually detected by a human who was very inquisitive, checked on a security level 0 event, somebody registering a second phone for two-factor authentication, happened to call them and say, "Do you have a new phone?" And the guy said no. And that one thing led to another, but no amount of defenses were able to catch it. Hafnium is the latest example of this, where automated defenses or perfect protection is not practical. No antivirus, no EDR, no protection was able to do the job. It underlines once again that perfect protection is not practical, and so also monitoring is necessary. An inquisitive human on the blue team is what you need. That happens to be exactly what EventTracker provides. So let's take a look at how this happens from an EventTracker perspective. So as I mentioned, when the attack happened, we provided an advisory and we published it on our customer service hub. You can reach that by going to my.netsurian.com. It's right here. This is the security advisory. We've been trying to keep it up to date, describing the problem, why it's critical, what the affected components are, what tools we're running, and what actions were recommended by the Security Response Center at the vendor, and what the mitigation steps by CISA. Of course, the key question is, before the attack really happened, what sorts of defenses or detections were possible with EventTracker, assuming that you could only get the Windows event logs from the affected Exchange server. In retrospect, there are other event logs generated by Exchange, but these may not be available. But you can see there are up to 8 different priority 1 alerts that exist within the EventTracker configuration that could conceivably have fired. And in the demo, we'll take a look at which one of them can or could have fired before we updated our knowledge pack, specifically identifying this as Hafnium. Alerts were possible. We have now added specific alerts that look at Hafnium style attacks, China chopper attacks, which is the web shell that is used or was used by these attackers. We have created some new saved searches and some new dashboards. And we have updated our threat intelligence center with indicators of compromise released by CISA. These include MD5 hashes, IP addresses, URL queries, and various command lines. Now, this is all, you can argue, bolting the barn door after the horse is bolted. Remember, the key trick when you're in detection and response is you're acting post breach. You're trying to minimize the damage and identify it as quickly as possible. By the way, Microsoft themselves have a nice blog, which they've been keeping up to date. Simply go search for Microsoft blog Hafnium, and you'll find this. And as you can see, they have provided the details of that particular web shell. Now let's go take a look at an instance of EventTracker and see what is it that EventTracker could have found had it been looking at the Windows event logs. Now we have made this occur at a company, at a demo company by the name of MTech. And we have simulated specifically the kind of attack and the web shell that was described in the blog. So before we released our knowledge pack on or around the 6th of March, if you happen to have had EventTracker and were receiving logs from the Exchange server on premise, the Windows Exchange server on premise, and it did do the web shell that was identified, then you would see things like a suspicious exploit attempted. You would see things like PowerShell running suspicious commands. And these would focus an analyst's attention that was looking at this to try and wonder what's going on this particular box. Right now, of course, after it was identified specifically as Hafnium and we updated the console with those rules, you can see that these are correctly tagged as Hafnium attacks. But before that, you could only know that it's odd to see these kinds of suspicious attacks. So we'll go over to threats. And again, focused on what life would have been like on March 2nd or earlier, pay attention to this particular box. And as you can see on an Exchange server, if that particular web shell had been running, you'd see something like 7-zip, proc dump. And if you expanded it, you could do a log search right here in the corner. And this would show you the different kinds of logs. Now, why is 7-zip running on an Exchange server? That can never be a good thing. So when you see it, you see that it's been launched by the IIS process. That's a problem. IIS never does this. So therefore, this must be something odd and unusual. If you wanted to examine that server in detail, you could pivot away to that particular machine. And now the entire scenario is sort of laid bare. You can see right here that it starts out with a web shell. And as identified by the folks at Microsoft, it's sitting in the OWA auth folder. And it's an ASPX style web shell. And then you can see that this in turn has spawned a JS, a JavaScript right here, causing a new process to get created. And this is what that process is doing. Again, launched by the web server, which can never really be a good thing. We identify it as a new, never seen before, which is another tip off. And then you see that 7Z has been created, and you can see it's trying to zip up, the PST file. So if you follow along, you'll see the entire attack as described by Microsoft conveniently laid bare. Again, remember, this is a demo. So it's very clean and neat in this, and it's easy to follow. In real life, an analyst would have to actually become aware that there is something quite not right on this and actually work in order to tie it together. Another way in which this can be caught is using the MITRE attack framework. So MITRE, as you know, has laid out tactics and techniques. And if we focus entirely on this particular machine, which is MTech's machine, why then we can see that there are activities are identified by MITRE. This include data compression, which is a common tactic and a technique during exfiltration. There is system network discovery. This is attempt by the web shell to spread its legs internally and see what's what. And then you see execution, that command line interface has happened. So in sequence, it will be execution first, discovery next, and exfiltration last. And of course, you can expand any of these in EventTracker. So this is what an analyst would have done in the days prior and identified that 7-zip was running on the EXE. So, what we're trying to say here is that the best way to detect these kinds of things is through good old-fashioned human. Now you have all of this stuff on the left of the breach. This is pre-breach, if you like, but nobody predicted that this was going to occur. Once it was occurring, there was no endpoint solution that actually caught it and killed it. So instead, you were reduced to detecting and respond. And the keys to the kingdom were how quickly. Yeah, we get that this is post-breach. But then folks that were able to detect it and patch it sooner suffered much less damage. And even today, nearly 2 weeks after the attack, that there are some folks that haven't patched, their Exchange box and are still vulnerable, or have patched, but then the attackers have had a foothold, prior to their patching. And now the question is, what is it that has happened? This is the entire kill chain. And you would like to be as early as you can in the kill chain, but both with SolarWinds as well as with Hafnium, really, it was only a detect and respond game. And this is why something like an EventTracker that collects logs and has a team of analysts looking at it is able to give you relief in cases where your prevention and your prediction weren't equal to the task. And I hope that's a message that you will take away. Thank you for your attention. Have a good day.